Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Experience Creators. If we have not met yet, my name is Carolene and I'm your host. And today my guest is Brian Miller, who is a magician turned author, speaker, and consultant on human connection. Brian works with organizations all over the world who truly believe that everyone deserves to feel heard, understood, and valued. Brian's TEDx talk, How to Magically Connect with Anyone, has had over 3.3 million views. And Brian is also the author of the book, 3 New People, where he brilliantly outlines a system for deepening relationships. This episode is all about human connection and the different perspectives that we all take as we go through different experiences in our lives, and how if we can deepen our understanding of the perspectives of other people, we can actually form deeper connections. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive in to this episode of The Experience Creators with Brian Miller. Brian, welcome to The Experience Creators. I'm over the moon that you're here to chat with me for the next 30 minutes or so. So why don't we just start? Let's start straight away. Who are you? Tell us a little bit about your story. You definitely have a really exciting one, and we crossed paths a little bit in terms of our traveling in the past. So yeah, tell us.
Caroline, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this. I love the concept of your whole show, and it's unique, and it feels like an opportunity to talk about some of the things that I usually do, but maybe in a slightly different way. So I'm excited for this. I won't bore your audience with my whole story because it's ridiculous and winding, but fundamentally, I was a magician for 10 years. That is what I did for a living. I did go to college. That surprises a lot of people. I have a dual bachelor's of science in mathematics and philosophy. As I like to tell people, I wanted to have no job and no life, so college was a great experience. And for years after that, people would be like, wow, you have a philosophy degree. What are you doing with that? And I would be like, I'm a professional magician. So you can see how that all wound. But yeah, no, I started magic professionally as a teenager, and it seemed better than working at McDonald's and as a way to make money in high school, and then just kind of kept doing it. And at some point I had a decision point between going to grad school to do a PhD. My whole family are academics. I'd been groomed all my life for that. And at the last hour, senior year of college, having already been accepted into PhD programs, I went, actually, I'm going to do card tricks for a living, and went off and did that. So I got to build my career from doing little backyard barbecues for 20 bucks a pop, 40 bucks a pop, sometimes just working for pop, for soda. And I ended up going off and building a nationally touring career, doing colleges, corporate, high-end private events. And somewhere around 2014, I started getting invited to do some speaking engagements because I had been successful doing something incredibly unusual. Most people don't get successful doing, right? I got really lucky, worked really hard, and people that want to go into being a comedian or a magician or a juggler, most people don't make it, or if they do, they scrape by. There's no shame in that. That's all I ever expected for myself. But since I had made it, I started getting invited to speak about what I had learned in my career, and right at that time is when I got invited to give a TEDx talk, which I called How to Magically Connect with Anyone, and I was just teaching kind of anybody how to learn what magicians have learned, which is magicians learn how to navigate between two very different perspectives. Our perspective knowing the secret, your perspective not allowed to know the secret, antagonistic relationship. How do we connect with an audience in spite of that antagonism? And I taught in this little 14-minute TEDx talk how to magically connect with anyone, and it went viral, 3 million views plus, and it just launched me into a career with what I do now: author, speaker, coach, consultant on human connection. So that's my story in a nutshell.
I love that idea of, from that magician point of view, of finding ways to connect differently with the audience. And as you were telling us that story, then I thought back to my time at Cirque du Soleil. I spent 10 years there, and there was, no matter what show that I was working for, there was always a clown, and most of them had some kind of magic in their act, whether it was good. Most of the time it was terrible, and that was the fun of it, but other times
Yeah.
there were some that were actually magicians. And when my biggest memory of those experiences was the fact that we were in completely different countries, and in any Cirque du Soleil show, except for I think one or two, there is no recognizable language spoken, with the premise of we want the audience to create their own stories by what is happening in front of them. And so a lot of the clowns, the magicians, they didn't communicate through language. They communicated through sound, through body language, through what they were actually doing. And it was so powerful because we were not communicating in like you and I are doing right now. We were communicating by feeling and by connection. And that's why when I watched your TED talk, which is absolutely incredible, I really resonated with that. And really, it took me back to me sitting in the big top watching these performances of these clowns and these magicians that I had no idea what they were saying. They had no idea what they were saying. They were just making up their own language. But for somehow we were able to connect in that moment.
Yeah, well, that's a really insightful recognition there for what it's worth, because a lot of people don't think of magic in that way. Magic to a lot of people is kind of a very silly thing. Oh, it's just for kids, even though I think most magicians actually work for adults these days. Like, magic is way better for adults for what it's worth than it is for kids, because kids kind of believe anything's possible. So when you do magic for a kid, they're like, yeah. Like, you said you were a magician, why wouldn't you be able to do magic? You know, like, it's not that impressive. Like, you actually have to know what's not possible for magic to be interesting. And so what's really insightful about what you just said is I hear a lot in the entertainment circles. For years, I've always heard comedy, humor is the universal language. I don't think that's true, because while I've been in comedy for a long time and was a comedy magician, comedy is very contextual. It's very based on the culture, the language, you have to both have a shared understanding, a pre-existing shared understanding and language for comedy. Mm-hmm. But magic, to me, magic really is a universal language, because to your point, there didn't need to be any language. Magic is very clear. When something impossible happens, it's very clear to everybody that it's impossible, because everybody understands what impossible is, no matter what your culture or language is. And even more than that, if you put a billion-dollar CEO next to, I don't know, a poverty-stricken child from somewhere else in the world, and you showed them both at the same time the same magic trick, you showed a trick to them, both of them would go to the same place emotionally at the same time. And there's nothing else on planet Earth that does that but magic. It's very special.
It's whenever I was feeling complacent or bored or frustrated at work, my remedy was to sneak into the big top and just stand at the back. And I wasn't watching the stage because I'd seen the show hundreds of times. I was watching the audience. And what you just described is exactly what I saw in those moments. I would watch people from 5 years to 95 years old and just watch the wonderment or the happiness, the laughter in their face. And that just changed everything for me, because I was seeing what they were experiencing, but I was watching them. I wasn't even watching what was going on stage. I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, now I'm like thinking of so many amazing memories. Okay, so this TED talk that you gave, I watched it recently, over 3 million views. It is incredible. For anyone listening or watching, the link will be down below, so please do check it out. It's about 15 minutes long, not too long. Now, in it, you really talk a lot about perspective taking. And one thing that you say as you're describing how you are performing your magic is that the knowledge of the experience itself is a limiting perspective. So as soon as you said that, it was like, it just did something to me. I was like, whoa, I wrote it down straight away. And I was like, I need to speak to him about this. So can you elaborate a little bit on that and just let us, I want to know from an experiential point of view, like how that comes into play.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's so funny because, you know, in the years since, I've obviously done, as you might expect, a lot of interviews about the TEDx talk. And I've spoken and I've answered a lot of questions about it. And I think you're the first person who's ever asked me about that particular line, that particular idea, because it's actually one of the core ideas in the keynotes, in the workshops that I do for organizations. It's actually fundamental to most of the work I do. So it's a really great thing. I'm so happy you asked about that and not any of the other things in there. So this idea that your experience, your knowledge, the way I phrase it in the TEDx talk, I'm talking about a magician and saying, as a magician, your knowledge of the secret is a limiting perspective. It's limiting. And what I mean by that is when you know something that only you know, or that the person you're speaking to or trying to connect with doesn't know, you would think that this unique thing inside your head is what gives you the ability to connect with people, right? Because I'm a unique, special flower, and aren't we all? But what it actually does is it tightens, it narrows your ability to see outside of yourself. The more you know about something that the person you're trying to connect with doesn't know, the harder it is to see outside that box. So as a magician, here's what's really interesting. I can't create magic for somebody who knows the secret. I can't. Because if you knew the secret, you couldn't be fooled by it, you couldn't experience wonder, you couldn't be amazed. In fact, the most interesting thing about magic is that I can only create magic for you if you have a different perspective. It's actually required that you have a different perspective. I don't connect with you, I don't share magic with you in spite of the fact you have a different perspective. I share magic with you because you have a different perspective. It's required. And so what we need to recognize is that we go through our lives with all these thoughts, ideas, hopes, dreams, beliefs, worries, concerns rattling around in our own brains. And those things that make us unique and special, which is wonderful, also limit us because they put these blinders on and we start to think that everybody's going through or has gone through a similar experience. And the only way to connect with somebody is to abstract yourself from your own unique perspective and experience and seek to understand theirs, because theirs is completely different. And even people you'd think had a similar experience to you, grew up in the same town, in the same year, same age, same race, whatever it is, you'd be shocked to find how completely different their worldview is when you start to ask questions. So that is essentially what I mean, and where it translates, as I'm sure you might imagine, into the world of creating experiences and events, is recognizing that as the creator of the event, your perspective, what you want to achieve with that event, is often very different from what the people attending it are hoping to get out of it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. That's what I talk about with anyone that I'm working with. That's exactly that. Like, how do you want your guests to feel? And probably what's going to happen is very different to actually what you think is going to happen. And as you were talking about perspective taking, then the first thing that came to mind for me was traveling. You know, both you and I have traveled extensively.
Right.
And, you know, I grew up in Australia. I have a very big disconnect with Australia. I don't even consider myself really Australian anymore. And so when people ask me about Australia, I have a different perspective, and they're often very surprised and shocked, because for a lot of people, Australia is a dream destination. Why would you ever leave there? You're so lucky, the beaches, the kangaroos, but you know, and I am fully aware that it is an incredible country, and there's no part of me that does not think that. But for me personally, my own perspective on my experience there, I prefer to be elsewhere. And so it's this really interesting dynamic of, they already have a predetermined idea of what Australia is like. Me, as someone who's grown up there, has my own experience and my own definition of what it is like to be Australian. And because there's a bit of a disconnect for me, the conversation can get very kind of jolted, because my response is not what they're expecting. But then it starts this beautiful conversation, you know, about how we've experienced that place from different eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think it's really important to double down here, because I'm not sure I even really gave an explanation or a definition of what perspective taking is. This is a term psychologists use. This is a real, actual term. It's not something, no magician you would ask would tell you that that's what they are really good at, is perspective taking. Magicians don't know that term. What I realized was, this is what magicians master, having no idea that there's a term for this, and it's been studied. It's been studied by psychologists, and what perspective taking is here's the layman way of explaining it. It's the ability to say, I'm here, but I can see why you're there, right? And maybe, just maybe, there's this space in between where we can create something wonderful together, leave uplifted, inspired, changed for the better, right? That's what it is. What perspective taking really is clinically is the ability to see the world from the point of view of another person. And this sounds trivial, right? It kind of sounds like, well, yeah, obviously. But it's one of those things that's simple, but it's not easy. It's really simple, but it's very difficult. If you've ever actually tried to take on somebody else's point of view, you find you keep getting blocked by that limited perspective that you already have. It's so hard to climb out of that box. And part of the reason is that we infuse our own perspective, our experiences, even into the questions we ask people without realizing it. We lead people towards what we already know, what we already believe in conversations, like you were describing with Australia. I'm guessing most people, when they ask you about Australia, contained right within the question is, I want you, Caroline, to tell me how wonderful Australia is and confirm what I already believe about it, right? Like, oh, you're from Australia. Even just like the way they would express the question, their idea is already built in, as opposed to saying something like, you're from Australia. That's so interesting. Why aren't you there anymore? For what reason did you leave? Which is fairly neutral and lets you decide, lets you tell me, lets you bridge that gap and give me a new perspective. It's a very different way of phrasing the question. Or, oh, I went to Australia once. I had a great time. But I'd be curious to hear from someone who actually lived there what it was like.
Right.
That's a very different way of phrasing it, where you can try to get at least some of your own perspective out of the question.
So when you are, you're this incredible speaker speaking in front of all different kinds of audiences, whether it's corporate, whether it's event style, what are the questions that you ask yourself as you're creating your presentations, your speeches, really to try and kind of get into the mindset of what your audience will be expecting, or the perspective that they already have of, and the predetermines that this guy is coming on here to teach us about X, Y, and Z? What are those questions that you start to ask yourself to try and kind of uncover that?
Yeah, so the first thing, and you hit it right on the head when you said, what questions do you ask yourself? Because just first and foremost, I think a lot of people don't ask themselves questions like that at all. They don't think at all about that. And that's not a knock on what people do. We're not trained to do that. And this is part of the problem. At no point when you were a child in school, in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, in college, you've never been taught to do perspective taking. It's not a part of our learned experience. This is something you have to deliberately learn. You'd think it would be built in somewhere, how to connect with another human. But it's not. We just kind of assume that people learn to do this naturally. And maybe we did thousands of years ago, but we definitely don't today in the industrial, complex, educational world that we live in, where everything's about the test. So the first step is asking yourself that question, simply asking yourself, what is the point of view of the audience? What might these people be going through in their head before they step in the door? In and of itself, that gets you so far, because at least you're thinking of them now and not you. And I think what trips a lot of people up is simply the phrasing of the question that they ask themselves. So let's say you are asking yourself that question. The way you ask yourself the question still matters. If you ask yourself, how do I give, or the way that a lot of people ask this question is, how do I create this experience that I want them to have, right? That's the way people ask it. How do I create an experience that I want them to have? And really, a better way to ask yourself that is, what experience do these people want to get, right? Instead of what am I creating, how do I get them to have the experience I'm creating, right? How do I get, right, the experience? How do I get them to have the experience I want them to have? What experience are they hoping to get out of this? Why are they coming here? Why do people come to magic shows? Why do they go to conventions? Why do people fly 1,000 miles to spend 3 days in a dirty, dim-lit, low-lit conference room at a Holiday Inn Express? Why do they do that? It's not for the weak coffee and stale pastries, right? And it's definitely not to see that cool transition you spent an hour on in your PowerPoint presentation. That's not why they're there, right? So we get lost in trying to create the experience that we want to give them, instead of asking, what experience are they hoping for? What are they trying to get? Because this is something that psychologists, again, and therapists know. My wife is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and one of the things I learned from her in her work is that you need to meet people where they're at. And this is another one of those things that's like, you're going to hear it and go, oh, light bulb, but then you realize how hard this is to do. Meet people where they're at. And what I mean by that is, a lot of experiences, performers, even just in a conversation, we approach it with our own ideas, with our own energy, with what we've been through that day. And a lot of times what happens is, like, it's like the plane takes off without without the passengers, right? We take off without the audience. We take off without the person that we just met that we're having a conversation with in line at the coffee shop. We just go, I'm excited about this thing and I'm going to just shove it at them. And we go. And what we know for sure is that when a plane takes off without you, you don't chase the plane down the tarmac, right? You know what happens when a plane takes off without us? First of all, people get annoyed when the plane leaves without them. So if now they're annoyed with you, and then they just go find another plane. They don't spend any more time thinking about you or worrying about you. They go somewhere else. So if you don't want them to have that experience, you need to meet people where they're at. And I think one of the problems here is that people don't always know what they want. This is where we have trouble sometimes. You go, I want to give people an experience that they want, but people don't always know what they want, right? There's that famous Henry Ford quote where he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? They didn't know they wanted a car. There was no such thing as cars. Steve Jobs knew this. Nobody he could have asked would have said, I want an iPhone. Nobody knew an iPhone was possible or what it would look like. What he did know is people wanted a BlackBerry that actually worked, that wasn't impossible to use. What they wanted was the ability to take their work with them. What they wanted was less stuff. They didn't want to have a phone and a computer and a thing and a this and my pockets are full and my pants are sagging down. And what he did was he gave them what they wanted in a way they never expected. And if you can do that, like the experience is going to be phenomenal for your guests.
Yeah, and I always love to start with that question of like, how do you want them to feel? Because I also find when you're working with experienced creators, especially events and whether it's a short event like a night or a longer event like a retreat, conversation gets very operational very, very quickly, and then on the arrival and then this and then the rooms and I kind of backtrack a little bit and say, let's start with how do we want them to feel once they've left? And then we can kind of backtrack from there. I think it's so important. And I think these kind of questions, if we're not asking those questions again and again, because whether you're speaking on stage, whether I was working at Cirque du Soleil, working in different countries, our audience is always changing, right? So it's important to be continually readdressing that very core as to how do you want them to feel, or in your case, how do you want them to experience, what is their expectation of the experience?
Yeah, well, and there's something that's changed over the last few decades, and I think that the way that people used to in the pre-digital world, where we're inundated with what's possible and where celebrities feel like our friends and all this stuff, what people used to want was an experience to feel like its own world outside of the real world, like in its own bubble in space and time, right? We want to go to the theater and see the performer and they just come out and do their act. We're just going to see their act, what they want to create, the artist, right? And I don't think that's what most people want out of experiences anymore. People want to feel like they're a part of it, like they could have coffee with the performer, or just or they could be a part of that experience if they wanted to. And so sometimes I think today we get hung up on our own kind of like, but what about my artistic integrity? And that's great. Have artistic integrity. But if what you're making is for you, then just make it for you. But if you're making it just for you, you don't get to complain if people don't buy it, if they don't like it, if they don't show up, right? I play guitar just for me. I have 5 albums that have been professionally produced. They're available for sale on Amazon and iTunes, and they're at Spotify. You can stream them. You know how many people have bought or streamed those albums over the last few years? You know how many? No, I was asking because I have no idea, because I don't check. It's not for them. I made them for me. And if I went to check, that would be me saying, I made this for somebody else, and now I have to care what people think. I don't care what people think of the music I make because I make that for me. But I probably shouldn't hang my hat on making a living with music if I'm making it for me, right? But in my work as a speaker, as a consultant, as a coach, that work is for other people. It's not for me. So I can't just be like, my artistic integrity, this is how I want my workshops to go. The people who are attending it matter. They're the whole reason I'm doing it. So you really have to be clear on what's for you and what's for other people. And it doesn't mean you can't make the experiences that you're creating, you can't get your art in there, but it has to serve the audience. And I think what you said is really important. How do you want people to feel when they leave? Because anybody who's been in an experience world knows people don't remember any of the details.
Mhm.
None. They don't remember a single line that the comedian said. You know what they remember? The first thing that happened and the last thing that happened. They remember how they were treated when they walked in the door. They remember the last thing that happened right before they left. As a magician, they remember your first trick and your last trick. Which, by the way, magicians know this. You can have a pretty crappy show for most of it. As long as you have a great opening and a killer closing, people loved it. They'll rave about it. You shouldn't do that, but you could, right? Which also means if you make a mistake, if there's a mishap somewhere in the middle, just finish strong and you're fine, because people remember how they felt about an experience. And I'll give you one more quick anecdote. I just remembered this. A few years ago, there obviously in America it's been brutal with for a long time now with kind of mass shootings and things like that. And I forget where I was, somewhere in the middle of the country. I was like in a 3-month tour doing speaking engagements and some magic shows. And I was on a college campus. I do a lot of college campuses in the fall every year. And there had been, I realized that I had remembered seeing something in the news that where I was that night, just an hour or two away, had been a mass shooting. And I think it was targeted at LGBTQ community just a couple of days earlier. And I'm on a liberal college campus in America, which means there's a very good chance there's a high LGBTQ population. And so I asked the organizer I think it was a magic show, before the show, said, hey, I noticed that thing that happened a couple days ago. I'm so sorry to hear about that. That was pretty close to here, right? And she said, yeah, it was like 90 minutes away. A bunch of our students are from that town, kind of a thing. And I was like, okay, how's the mood on campus? Like, is that a topic of conversation? She's like, it's all anybody's talked about for the last 2 days. Okay. So in that moment, I have to decide. When I walk on stage, they introduce me, the music comes on, everybody cheers. Do I walk on stage and have the magic show that I was always going to have, ignore the real world and give them an escape? Or if I do that, do I risk them thinking that I'm being tone deaf and that I'm totally unaware of what's going on in their world? 30 years ago, you ignore it. You do the show and give them an escape. 3 years ago when this happened, 4 years ago, I said, no way, I have to say something. So first, before the show, I didn't hang out backstage hidden away like a celebrity. I chatted with people as they came in. I shook hands. I met people. I talked to them. I said, how you guys doing? How you guys feeling? By the time I got on the stage when they introduced me, the first 3-4 rows already knew that I understood what had happened recently and that I was open to that. And the first words I said, I'm so glad you're all here tonight. Normally I would start the show high energy. I just want to let you all know I'm really sorry to hear about what happened a couple days ago. When the show's over, if anybody wants to hang out, have a group conversation, talk about it, share how you're feeling, I will hang out. But until then, let's have a great magic show. How's that sound, everybody? And everybody cheered, and we had the most raucous, funniest people laughing, falling out of their chairs show for an hour. They gave me a standing ovation. When the show was over, 40 students stayed with me for another hour having a real conversation. And that show could have been a disaster if I had not acknowledged the experience that they were having, because what they normally would have enjoyed that night didn't matter. It had to be something different, and it had to be for them. So that's a very extreme circumstance, but that's the kind of thought process that I think event professionals who really care about experiences have to go through.
Yeah, we were playing when I was working with Cirque du Soleil. We were playing in Paris when the Bataclan attacks happened, and we were in the city as it was happening. Some of us were downtown, and we cancelled the show. I think it was a city order, like 2 weeks or something like that, no entertainment. But I'll never ever forget. We had a company meeting, which is all 100 of us on tour or so, and the artistic director of the show, she was leading the meeting, and she said to us, she said, tonight we have the most important role that we've ever had on this show. She said, it is our responsibility to take these 2,000 people and to help them escape for 2 hours, because the atrocities that currently exist out on the streets of Paris and everywhere else in Europe, but in particular, but what they're experiencing right now is basically hell. And it is our responsibility to take them away from that, if only for 2 hours. And I'll never,
Right.
ever forget her saying that, because just like you with your situation, how can we acknowledge that situation and then create an experience that is appropriate for it, but that B really acknowledges what they're going through, but also what we can do to either alleviate the pain, to make them laugh maybe when they needed it the most, or in your case, be able to form those connections before and afterwards that you normally wouldn't have necessarily done before, you know. And there's so much power from even just around the actual event itself.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to finish with the golden question of the experience creators. We've spoken, I feel like it'll be in a culmination of everything that we've spoken about thus far. I love speaking with anyone who has different perspectives and ideas about what makes a great experience. So that is my question to you. In your opinion, in your own context, what elements make up an incredible experience?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I have two answers, and they're at odds with each other.
Okay.
The first answer is the most important element of a great experience is connection. It's no surprise to anybody I'm going to answer that. I'm a human connection specialist, and I do tend to see the world through that vantage point, right? Like if you go to an oncologist, they'll tell you that you have cancer. And then if you go see a dermatologist, they'll tell you that your skin needs problems, right? Like everybody sees the world from their own vantage point. But I really do believe that the element of a great experience that really matters most is a connection. And in any way, connection, it could be to yourself, right? People come to an experience to feel more connected with who they are, to better understand themselves and their place in the world. It could be connection to the people they came with, to feel more connected with their friends and family. It could be to form new connections with the strangers, people they never met before, to feel something larger than themselves. It could be to the world in the abstract, to feel more connected with the universe, as it were. So I think connection is it really is the fundamental element, because if not for that, what is any of it for? Right? Why are we doing this? And the second answer is it doesn't matter what I think makes a great experience, because I'm not the attendee. It just doesn't matter. It only matters what the people coming, what the people I'm trying to connect with think makes a great experience. That's the end all be all.
Oh, I love that. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the Experience Creators. For all of those watching, for those listening, please connect with Brian down below. He's first of all starting with his incredible TED Talk, and then you can connect with him via many different platforms, which are all listed. So Brian, thank you so much, and thank you for being such an incredible experience creator yourself.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Experience Creators. If you liked the video, if you found it valuable, inspiring, and you now have some new tools at your disposal to help bring the experience that you offer to life, make sure to like the video down below. Also, make sure that you subscribe and turn on your post notifications so that you are made aware the next time an expert graces the Experience Creator stage.
Don't forget, everyone, that one great experience has the potential to change someone's world.